Hey, everybody. Welcome to our next episode of Lead Balloon Rock Talk. And today, what we're going to discuss a little bit is some terminology and specifically towards how we define rock and roll, rock, pop, and classic rock. Those are the terms that are used pretty frequently for everything that we talk about or are going to talk about. And we just want to kind of make sure that everybody understands where we're coming from. So,
And we may not agree completely on everything as well.
yeah, and again,
yeah, hashing it out in front of you all, and kind of hopefully we touch on something that everyone appeals to. So
exactly. Yeah, I mean, when we're talking terminology, it becomes very subjective in many ways. I mean, there's a lot of fluidity on how what people talk about um, or how they would describe something. So we're just going to dig in and see what happens here. And I think to start the conversation, I wanted to ask you if when you're listening to music, do you tend to listen to the lyrics or do you tend to listen to the music? Because this will have implications as we work through these.
I know exactly where you're going with that too, but I'll humor you with my commentary here, and it varies from band to band.
Okay.
So it depends on the band I'm listening to. All right, let's just say, for instance, it's a brand new band. What grabs me first and foremost is the music.
Okay.
I'm not interested in the lyrics. I feel it first. So that's important, I think, to understand that the music is something that you're feeling and you resonate with that sound. It draws you in because not every piece of music does that to me, and I'm sure it doesn't do that to everybody else. And we were kidding around the other day, and I was saying that there are basically two forms of music that I don't really listen to and care much for, and one of those being opera. So it doesn't matter what opera you put on, I'm not listening to it because it's not grabbing me. It doesn't do much for me. Secondly, if it's in Italian or German, I'm at a loss. So,
sure.
Yeah, so I think I would say probably 80% of the time I'm listening to the music first. And now that we don't have jacket covers that we can sit and read the lyrics to,
right,
you kind of have to do your own research ahead of time, and it's different. That's all. It's just a different way of, I guess, approaching that issue. And but I would say you feel it. I listen to it, and then I'll listen to the lyrics more and more. And sadly, I'm really a bad person when it comes to lyrics because I'm probably like everybody else sitting in the car. I remember the chorus, and then I remember like 3 or 4 words, and I'm like, and then I hum and I sing like 2 more words. I'm like, oh yeah, I don't know those.
Yep.
And I never memorize songs. I have a hard time memorizing things in general. So,
right.
I think I grasp more of the musical side than I do the lyrical side.
Okay. Yeah, I tend to be the same way. I treat words as kind of as another instrument within the texture of instruments. So I'm not listening to the words for meaning. I'm listening to them in terms of rhythm and just another sound within the bigger picture. And when I talk to people and I ask that question, there are a lot of people who gravitate towards the lyrics. They listen to a song, they listen to something because of the lyrics and not so much the music. And I was just curious because this definitely has implications as we get into our meanings, our definitions. So rock and roll. Let's start with rock and roll. So rock and roll. Just to give a brief history, really came to be called rock and roll around 1954, and actually it was referred to as rock and roll a couple of years before that by Alan Freed, who was a DJ in Cleveland, who was calling the music that he was playing on the radio rock and roll, and rock and roll really only lasted until about 1959 or so, and we'll talk a little bit about the reason why it kind of dropped off a little bit at that point. So we're talking about a 5-year period of time where rock and roll truly was what we would considered to be rock and roll. And as I was looking into various definitions, um, it really was a musical style that developed out of a melding of gospel, jump blues, jazz, boogie woogie, rhythm and blues, and country music. And it typically used not only the guitar and the drum set and an upright string bass, but usually a piano or a saxophone was in there as well. And eventually the guitar became more of the principal.
Now, my understanding of that is a little less with that. It was more I thought, focused on the drums, the guitar, and the bass. And typically that would have been an upright bass. It would have been an acoustic guitar, more on the country side of things.
Right.
And probably a snare and a hi-hat and potentially a bass drum for the backbeat in that straight, that bluesy feel, that 12-bar blues.
Yep. And well, and you know, and I think the piano and well, if you look at like say Jerry Lee Lewis, the piano was front and center, and same with Little Richard. And so the piano, that keyboard sound was definitely integral to early rock and roll. Probably even more than saxophone. But yeah, so I mean, those were the kind of the primary instruments that we're talking about. The beat was essentially a dance rhythm, and the backbeat really became the one of the crucial aspects. And the backbeat would be like on beats 2 and 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, with the snare drum. So that became the standard, if you will, basic format. And
so stop for a second.
Yeah.
So how do you explain this? This is Spinal Tap, rock and roll.
Well, yeah, and we'll get into that because you know it's
rock and roll. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you look up terminology of what rock and roll stands for, you know, a lot of the connotations were sexual. You know, it was primal.
Elvis Presley.
And yeah, and you know, so it was primal. It was sexual, and we'll talk about how it shifted over to rock. But just to kind of finish, so rock and roll in the 50s kind of went down 2 tracks, if you will. They were very closely aligned, but there was some differences. You had the track of, say, Chuck Berry and Little Richard, who were more jazz and doo-wop, the blues style coming out of, you know, R&B. And then you had the rockabilly, which was more of the Memphis sound, where you have Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Johnny Cash. And that was more of a country-inflected rock and roll. So you have these 2 tracks that were close, but not quite. And as they were, you know, during that 5-year period, there was, you know, this music was a new sound. It was a whole new thing. And
now let me ask you real quick here.
Yeah.
Would you say that because it was more regional, those different sounds existed, much like it is, like, you know what I'm saying when I say regional? So if you had a Nashville sound versus a New York sound,
yep,
they're very different. That's why I say Jerry Lee Lewis. You know, if you listen to him and then you go to an Elvis sound, they're different.
But they both were coming out of Memphis because they both recorded at Sun Studios, at least initially. But a lot of the rock and roll roots really come out of the South. So you have different regions within the South, definitely. So the other thing that was also happening in the 50s, which made this music, this new kind of music, kind of become popular the way it did, was that for the first time ever, teenagers were being recognized as teenagers. And it was a whole consumer market. And the 45 record had just been pretty much invented and put out there. So teenagers were now being targeted as consumers of their own entertainment, and this music was definitely appealing to them. And it was, a lot of the, so like what Chuck Berry brought to the whole thing was that he was telling stories in his songs. He brought in the electric guitar and the electric guitar solo. He had swagger, and then you have Elvis, who had swagger in a slightly different way, and he was singing about love and these things that.
And grinding his hips
Yeah,
simultaneously.
and so teenagers were gravitating to this, and it wasn't sophisticated. It was, like I said earlier, it was a bit more primal, and kind of that's how I see rock and roll. That's how it's kind of defined in my mind. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, I know when we were initially talking about doing this episode and laying groundwork here, we each kind of laid out our idea what rock and roll was, and I go back to my little snippety comment about, this is Spinal Tap and rock and roll.
Yeah.
Because if you think about that, people today would be very hard pressed to say there's any difference between the two. In fact, I think it's really kind of reversed itself at this stage. More people identify rock and roll as that groove, that hard four count, possibly the instruments that are played. The electric guitar usually have a lead guitar and a backup guitar, a bass, and a drum at the very basics. And usually somebody was singing within that realm, either the bass player or the drummer or whatever. And so the advent of adding or additional instrumentation to it, I think really defines what rock is, because as you said with the intro, there are all these other deviations that come out of what rock is. And so you have hard rock, you have metal rock, you have alt rock, you know what I'm saying? And it's punk rock. So to define rock and roll, I think it really is a part of that blues part, because I really honestly think, that
Oh yeah, definitely.
rock and roll, we can't escape that, and I love it, and I can't get enough of it. And it doesn't matter what band is playing; if I hear that bluesy twang somehow intermingling in there, I'm listening. My ear is up. So as we go into define what rock is, that may alter things, and this goes back to what you were saying about lyrics, I think. So
Yeah.
I'll let you deviate into that. That's a good segue.
So yeah, so let me. Like I said earlier, rock and roll, as it was defined in the '50s, pretty much found the end of its road at the end of the '50s, and that came about because of several factors. One, we had the plane crash that took Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper and Richie Valens. We had Elvis Presley going into the army. We had Little Richard, who found ministry, and then Alan Freed got caught up in the big payola scandal, which is a whole topic unto itself for another time. But rock and roll kind of had its glory for about 5 years. It kind of went away, but in its place, we had other things were starting to develop. For instance, in the early '60s, this whole rock and roll primal idea kind of went into areas like garage band rock and surf rock and things like that. And it was, if you study punk music, those were the very earliest beginnings of what you would call the punk aesthetic. And then by 1962, the Beatles were on scene, and they were making pop music, and we're going to talk about pop music in just a minute here. But I would say by around 1965 is when the term rock started to take over. And there's a couple factors that I've been looking at, and I really strongly believe that these were important factors. One was all along folk music had been kind of getting more and more sophisticated, and sophisticated in terms of lyrics. And so lyrics were now going beyond just talking about your love interest or a breakup. It was now talking about deeper issues. It was focusing on some um, issues, political issues, things like that, things that were happening in the country. And then you had Bob Dylan at the Newport Jazz Festival, who went electric. And then you had the EP, album oriented rock. Albums were, and that started really happening with Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, and definitely with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, where it was no longer singles driven; it was album driven, and something like uh, Sgt. Pepper's it was telling a story through the whole length of the album and not just song by song. And so rock was kind of growing up. It was going beyond the screaming teenagers, and it was appealing to um, older teenagers and definitely in the people in their 20s and so on. The lyrics were more sophisticated and complex. The music itself was becoming a little bit more complex. You were starting to get into psychedelia,
Well, this goes and dips back into the idea that, you know, country music really and gospel music told stories. It was about what was going on.
yep.
And I think this just elaborated itself and grew because of the instruments that were coming in. The more electric it started to sound, the more intense the lyrics became and identifiable to people more so. You know, I alluded this to something back in one of the other episodes where I was talking about Ozzy, you know, and I was saying that a lot of bands were, you know, bubblegummy kind of music,
Yep.
and Ozzy's like, we were angry and we just wanted to get that anger out, and so we didn't want gentle, we wanted
But
angry.
the music of the 60s and definitely the later 60s could not have happened without what transpired before it.
True. No, I
You know,
agree.
but and the music, the rock and roll of the 50s was in hindsight, it was innocent sounding in some ways, but they were playing around with distortion in the guitars, and they were playing around with some ideas that led to what was happening and really bloomed in the 60s. And I think rock and roll, the term, did not suffice for the evolution that took place. It had to go to rock. And then now you and I have argued this, that AC/DC, for instance, they call their rock and roll. It's but is it really rock
Right.
and
And
roll, or is it rock? And
hard.
and that's where subjectivity comes in. And I call it rock because I think it's of the ideology of what transpired in the late '60s. The
But it doesn't roll. Yeah, let's go rock, or let's listen to some rock and roll. You know, you have to look at it like
yeah,
that.
and I
What
can
are
see
people
that.
saying and defining it as? I think people have defined it naturally because over time it has evolved to that. And I liken it to the idea that, you know, we have the ability as human beings to change our minds. And I don't think we did it on purpose. I think subconsciously the 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 FM radio stations, the DJs have all helped to promote that idea. This is rock and roll. This is a rock and roll channel. It's not a rock channel. This is a rock and roll channel. And if you know, WKRP in Cincinnati, perfect example. You
Yeah,
see what I mean? That was all
yep,
rock and roll. Even though that was a television show, the idea is that that was in the 70s, where and I think in the 70s and the 80s, 90s, and as the music blossomed and we got more and more different types of genres out there of music, and we started classifying this is this, this is this, this is this. It got really confusing. In the early days, you could just say, well, if it had this kind of beat to it, that was rock.
yep.
And I don't think we call things rock anymore. I just think it's all just lumped together as rock and roll. And you can say
Well,
that the origin started as rock and roll because of the origins of how it started on the airwaves but I
I
won't
like
take
this
that. I
quote.
won't take the historical part.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say that at all. My argument really is I think we've evolved in the music world that says this is rock and roll. This is what it is, and it's here to stay. And that's AC/DC. Rock and roll ain't noise pollution. Rock and roll is just rock and roll.
Right.
And I think they sum it up perfectly like that, and that's why I
So,
hearken it to all of that. And again, it's the umbrella term. I think rock is the umbrella term, and rock and roll pulls all those different genres in.
so let me read this. This is I pulled this from
So here we go.
Well, since the term rock started being used in preference to rock and roll, particularly from the late 1960s, it has usually been contrasted with pop music, with which it has shared many characteristics, but from which it is often distanced by an emphasis on musicianship, live performance, and a focus on serious and progressive themes as part of an ideology of authenticity that is frequently combined with an awareness of the genre's history and development. According to Simon Frith, who is a rock writer, rock was something more than pop, something more than rock and roll. And rock musicians combine an emphasis on skill and technique with the romantic concept of art as artistic expression, original and sincere. So,
all right. So here I beg this then. It's just labels.
Ultimately, it is.
And how we label it is entirely up to the individual and how you define it. And like I said, we can go historical, which you started with, or we can kind of say, all right, that little 5-year period, it was its blossom, and then it exploded from there.
Yep.
And I think most people would probably agree with my idea. I'm not saying that I'm 100% right on all of this, but I think rock and roll is the term that will stick forever.
Okay.
I could be wrong.
So now let me throw in the term pop.
I just got to chill.
Well, and it's important because some of what we think to be rock or rock and roll could be also considered to be pop. Pop identifying factors usually include repeated choruses and hooks, short to medium length songs written in a basic verse chorus structure, and rhythms or tempos that can be easily danced to. So I'm going to break it down even farther. So the term pop music may be used to describe a distinct genre designed to appeal to all, as in the masses, often characterized as instant singles-based music aimed at teenagers, in contrast to rock music as album-based music for adults.
I agree with that.
Okay.
And
so
it's very simple. It really is. I don't argue any of what you just said. Nothing.
Okay. So
and it goes to what you said originally.
Yeah, let me do one more thing.
Yeah,
so art music is what I would call rock, and it is produced. It is to produce thinking and to provide a lens of commentary, and not always accessible. It's not focused on the masses.
What you're saying is glam rock follows that criteria?
Yeah, because it was not designed for the masses. It was designed for a specific. So
you're saying hair bands weren't designed for the masses?
What's that?
Hair bands were not designed for the masses, huh?
No, well, those I'd say were designed for the masses.
That was the whole gimmick. They took from David Bowie and go, well, let's throw some makeup on there. Peter Gabriel kind of paved the way for the theatrics of it, and then
I mean, I could see some of the glam rock being.
I mean, Kiss took it to the nth degree, I think.
Yeah.
Personally.
So glam rock maybe could be pop. Hair metal definitely is pop. And then
we're going to get a whole lot of comments on that one, I think, eventually.
Well, and so pop music, which I would include rock and roll, the music of the 50s, was focused on mass consumption. It is commercial and accessible and short lasting. And so
that was that doo-wop sound,
Yeah.
and
So
yeah, that
rock
was
and roll.
techno,
So
there
I
was
would say,
kick.
like, if we're talking AC/DC, okay, so I could almost see them as being rock and roll because they are more pop in their um, approach, kind of. And I'm not putting them with hair metal by any stretch, but I'm saying, so this is where the terminology can really get in. We're
Sticky.
getting quite philosophical here. So rock and roll, if we associate that with pop music, and rock as more focused. They have certain demographics. They're not going for the mass. So I use that kind of as my um, ultimate gauge of how I define. So what is rock to me and what is rock and roll is more like what's rock and what is pop. Is ultimately what I how I kind of define it.
At the end of the day, I think they're interchangeable.
And well, I don't know if they're necessarily interchangeable. Does it change my enjoyment of certain pieces? No. I can enjoy a piece of pop music or rock and roll music as much as I enjoy my rock music. But I see them as being different commodities in a sense, and and that's why I think and that's where the classic rock idea comes in. So, how would you define classic rock?
Well, I think it's pretty simple actually, because classic rock would be considered that from 1967 to about 1979 era. That's
Actually, it goes a
when
little bit into the 80s. I think they take a
I think it
few.
was waning at that point. I mean, people were craving something new because disco was
Yeah,
becoming
well,
hardcore, and you had nightclubs popping up every which way. And sadly, I have to say, you probably remember this in gym class. We were listening to the Bee Gees doing uh, flag things or something. I forget what
yeah.
it was, but that was all the rage, and you get wrapped up into that, and it came and went, as you know. But what replaced it basically was the advent of metal bands coming in
Yep.
and getting really good at stage performances and bringing it to a whole new level with fog machines and
Yep.
the lighting and laser shows that they stole from the bands like Pink Floyd early on, bands like Genesis who were really experimental. I think all these like really intense bands that kind of were off to the side, like I just said, influenced in some weird respect other bands that were popping up and going, well, what if we took this, and voila,
Yep.
that's us now.
Yep.
Perfect example of that would be like um, Judas Priest.
Hmm.
At the beginning, Judas Priest, they weren't dressed all up in leather and stuff, but as they started getting a little bit more on the popular side, they started shopping at S&M shops, and bike leather one sort of thing, but they had the dog collars and the spikes, and all of a sudden you get this hard driving band wearing this weird stuff with the chains and everything, and the next thing you know, punk music is using it,
Yep.
but they took it to the next level.
Yep.
Spiked hair and mohawks, makeup under the eyes, constantly all black, but they just did it differently. Like it was like this metal to punk shift over. I don't even know how to describe it, to be honest with you, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, so I think classic rock is it's definitely a radio format. It was
Oh,
designed to appeal to a certain demographic, and it was um, they were trying to create a canon of music. They were trying, again, I think it falls into this idea with rock music that they saw rock music as art music, artistic level music, and they wanted to create this canon. But they also didn't want it to be political. And so when you listen to this music, I mean, they have lots of, it's highly recognizable music, but it was not trying to push buttons and things like that. And I think And now, like you said, I mean, the music was that they played on this was from the late '60s up through late '70s, maybe early '80s, if that.
Hey, we agree on something.
But yeah, well, yeah. But now people are saying, well, what about music of the '80s and definitely into the '90s, and talking about the whole grunge scene and so forth. I mean, we're almost 30 years beyond when grunge came on the scene, and we're as far away from that as when classic rock became a radio format. So how do we, so
I
and
don't know.
how,
I think there is a still. I think there are remnants of grunge still out there with bands today. Um, for instance, I think you. I'm not calling them grunge, but something like Puddle of Mud,
Mhm.
POD, Saliva, Disturbed. They all have that edgy sound to them, but they're more rock and roll sounding or rock sounding, or whatever you want to define. Um, it's just that grab you by the throat kind of music that sucks you in, and they have the lyrics to back it up too.
Yep.
Sometimes I think people negate the idea that just because someone's using a different way of using their voice or vocal cords to make sounds, um, people call it screamo, if that's how you want to define it, but it's a way of making music. So, you don't have to like it. Let's put it that way. I'm not a huge fan of it, but it's like I can listen to it and I enjoy it at different levels, and especially my mood. I can get
Yep.
moody sometimes, and if I'm in the right mood, I just want to listen to that kind of music
Yep.
versus maybe listening to the Dead when I need to just come down from something. I just want to chill. There's music for that, all types of ways that you want to feel, and that kind of goes back to the beginning. So
Yep. So the to wrap this up, then, I think we've covered a lot of different territory in this conversation, and I think the how we listen to music, whether we listen to it from the music point of view or from the lyrics or from both, um,
well,
ultimately it doesn't matter, and it doesn't matter how you label things, but
yeah.
it helps to kind of see where why is something on a classic rock station. It's because somebody along the line labeled it rock, and what was behind that by giving it that label. And were
It's
they
like
thinking
defining
of it as
Velvet
higher
Underground as
art,
something else.
or were they thinking of it as throwaway pop? And why is the music of the '50s, why is rock and roll of the '50s not included in classic rock? Why is why
It doesn't fit the sound. There's a
what?
sound. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
AC/DC versus Elvis Presley. There's a very distinguishable sound.
Oh, there's
And if you
huge
grew up,
difference in sound. But
and
is
that generational difference is very important to think about because, that's like, unless you were one of these ultra hip parents who was just like, who constantly flows with whatever their kids are listening to at the moment and they gravitate to that at any given time. You know, I, I just, pop is just going to be what I consider like one hit wonder music. Basically, it's catchy, it's feel good music, it's toe tapping, get you up on the dance floor, but it won't last. It won't stand that test of time like classic rock will. That's what I think of when I think of something that's durational. Like a band like Led Zeppelin will never go out. They're just too recognizable. 50 years from now, there'll be kids going to the store and buying a Led Zeppelin T-shirt. They may not know anything about it, but they may have heard about it, and they
Mhm.
just want to like, oh, that was what they played back then. And we tend to resurrect things. We kind of go cyclical in everything, historically speaking, in anything and everything.
Yep.
Um, and music will do that as well. I think at some point we're going to have used the heck is the name of the voice machine? Autocorrect, auto tune.
Oh yeah.
You know, auto-tune's been really big in the rap music right now. It's been pretty popular with pop music like Justin Bieber and things like that. And at some point, people are going to be like, "That's auto-tuned again. Don't you have a real voice? You know, why are you using that?" It's hard to pull it off in a live performance as well. If someone's singing really bad and they rely on that thing to constantly correct their horrible singing, that's an issue.
Well, and then
Whereas
that comes
when
back to, is it pop slash rock and roll, or is it rock? Rock is thought to be more authentic, whereas pop is overproduced or produced at a very slick level using autotune and
yeah,
things like that. You go to a pop artist concert, everything is choreographed and
yeah,
you
they
know
don't have the
exactly the
dancers,
same from
and they
night to
don't
night.
have. Yeah, I agree
And
with the choreography part of it.
whereas you go to to be extreme, a Grateful Dead show, and you never know what you're going to get. You know, the same
Well, that's
tune is
said
going to
about a
sound
lot of bands.
different from night to night. So it's again, it's that how it's categorized. I just think it's interesting food for thought. I think across the board.
Labels,
Yeah,
labels.
labels
That's the danger
but
zone.
it's food for thought. It's um, maybe it helps kind of define for somebody how
I don't know. Maybe there's too many labels. Maybe we've gone too crazy trying to say, well, that doesn't fit this one's perfectly because it's not my definition. So let's invent a new one. And maybe we're killing music in general by putting so many labels out there. If we just bring it home a little bit and say, all right, well, if it's grabbing you by the throat, then it's rock and roll. If it's touchy feel good, you know, get up and dancey kind of thing, it's more poppy. And let it go at that.
well, and I think that's a good way to end this conversation, and that is that there are too many labels now, and I think it's very hard to get a grasp on the whole music scene anymore because there are so many labels and everything is fit under these labels. If you go on Spotify, if you even go on Billboard magazine online, the categories are there's so many more categories now than there ever were even 40 years ago. So in the
And I'm
end,
waiting
it's
for
all about labels.
psychedelic punk country bands.
Yeah. So
Label that.
yeah, well,
I challenge any viewer out there right now, come up with a new band, and you're going to try to meld country music and punk. You know, get the whole thing together.
yeah.
See what happens.
So with that, I think that's a good place to finish our
Yeah,
conversation
no,
tonight.
I think we've done a good job.
Yeah,
I
and
hope that you respect my view.
never. No, of course. I find it. I always find it fascinating to get reads on other people, and I think that I think that's ultimately what we have to do is respect each other's opinions, not just you and me, but all of us should be respectful of everybody's take on things. And we would certainly love to hear your comments on this topic. I mean, it's a huge topic. We've covered a lot of territory. Each one of these could have been its own program, but would love to hear your thoughts on this. And if you like this channel, we hope you'll subscribe and hit the little bell so that you get notification when we put a new one up. And with that,
Thumbs up it.
thumbs up it.
Like it.
Exactly. And with
So
that,
I'm Mark.
and I'm Jim, and
And
we'll say
hopefully
goodbye.
you guys are out there wanting some more of this. So we're going to do a special feature this week. So we're going to put out two for you guys to kind of look at. Today is a twofer, and
Yep.
our next one is a really cool. I think is really cool, where we are going to talk about underrated bands. And we talked about the origins of the 45, which is a really perfect segue for what we're going to do because we're going to do an A side and a B side.
Yeah, there we go. So
All
with
right.
that, we'll say goodbye. Okay.
All right. Excellent day. Talk to you soon, everyone.
See you next episode.